Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And we have such a great speaker today, and we are so thrilled that she accepted to come and join us and present her great work on science of water fluoridation. Dr. Kristen Taylor is an associate professor of psychology at York University. I'm going to ask her to introduce herself later on, but I just want to give you a background on why we are here with this topic and why we put it one of our priorities for this research group. So about several weeks ago, Rick North contacted me contacted some people in Annie and some members in Annie, and then I got involved in that, and I didn't know that much about fluoride, public fluoride, water fluoridation in our community. And the more I searched about that, the more I learned. And I thought, okay, this is one of the things that I'm missing. I usually involved in all those environmental issues, indoor air, outdoor air, water pollution, climate change or so, but this one I had missed it. So we had Rick and Chris speaking for us last month in our last meeting, and we learned a lot from them. But some members felt like we need a little bit more science behind this issue. And so we invited Bruce, and then we got connected to Christine, who is leading actually this research. And then we also found out that the American Nurses Association has a statement about water fluoridation that this does not hurt, so it's completely acceptable. And we sent out a proposal to ANA Assembly in changing of that statement. So it couldn't go through ANI because they didn't let us submit it from outside of the American Nurses Association. So I submitted through our state nurses association. It went, but it was rejected. It seems like they don't see that a priority or a health issue. It could be because of lack of knowledge or whatsoever that is. But anyway, now we want to learn a little bit more, and we're going to follow up on that proposal, and we're going to push ANA to change this statement, but we need a science background underneath that as a foundation to be able to talk to them stronger. Okay, with that introduction, I would like to ask Christine to start her presentation.
Great. Thank you, Azita, for that introduction, and to Annie for this invitation. So today, and I also am very glad to hear that Chris and Rick gave the primer on this topic, because I have to admit that when I talk about this topic, I don't always know where to begin, and the history is quite fascinating, and it provides really the background to how beliefs about safety of fluoridation were first established and then maintained over the past 75 years. So I'm not surprised to hear that this topic has not been on your radar. It's not on the radar of many people because it is commonly believed that fluoride in drinking water is safe and serves a beneficial purpose. So today I'll focus on discussing some of the scientific evidence testing fluoride's potential for developmental toxicity, which really does challenge the conventional beliefs about safety. So this map shows the percentage of the population receiving fluoridated water either due to water fluoridation or naturally occurring sources. Globally, only some countries add fluoride to drinking water, and this is mainly in the US, Brazil, Chile, Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand. These are the countries that I'm highlighting because over 50% of the population receives fluoridated water. This compares with about 39% in Canada and only 3% of Europe. So put another way, most developed nations do not fluoridate drinking water. Oh, I didn't think this slide came in. Okay. Up until, actually, I'm going to move up to here. Okay. Up until 2015, the optimal range for water fluoride was 0.7 to 1.2 milligrams per liter. And this range was selected based on data that was largely collected
Laura, you need to unmute people so that we can hear Christine. Seems like you muted everyone, so we can't hear Christine anymore.
Oh, oh. Can you hear now?
We can hear you, but not Christine.
Oh my gosh.
Christine, if you just click next to the little speaker next to your name, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Sorry about that.
Sorry, I was just trying to mute me.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. So did you hear the part about the black line? Can I explain this graph again?
No, Christine, please repeat that again.
Okay. Did you hear okay. From here, up until 2015, the optimal range for water fluoride was 0.7 to 1.2 milligrams per liter. And this range was selected based on data largely collected in the 1940s, suggesting that there would be a significant decrease in caries, and that's shown by this black line, and only a marginal increase in dental fluorosis, which is a staining on the teeth caused by overexposure to fluoride when teeth are developing. So the sweet spot was about 1 part per million for maximal benefit and minimal harm. But in 2015, the US Public Health Service lowered the recommended level of fluoride in drinking water to 0.7 part per million, which is the optimal level used in Canada. And this recommendation was made in response to trends in the prevalence of dental fluorosis, but also based on considerations of the availability of fluoride from other sources like toothpaste, and evidence on fluid intake among those who lived in regions with different outdoor temperatures, because different states in the US had different optimal levels of fluoride depending on the outdoor temperature. Now, when talking about fluoride, it is important to distinguish between topical and systemic sources. Fluoride is found in very high concentrations in topical sources, such as dental products, but these exposures are not meant to be ingested. Systemic sources of fluoride include some food types, like grapes, in which fluoridated pesticides are commonly used, like sulfuryl fluoride, water, of course, and other beverages like tea, which can have high concentrations of natural fluoride leached from the soil. Other sources include pharmaceuticals, including halogenated anesthetics, like sevoflurane, as well as supplements. Now, this figure shows that drinking water, which is shown by these lavender bars, for youth, is our main source of fluoride. Now, toothpaste, shown by this green bar, is representing an important source of intake, especially for preschool-age children, but not so much for older individuals who are properly expelling the toothpaste. Now, most people assume that adding fluoride to public drinking water supplies is a safe and effective way to prevent tooth decay. After all, this practice has been endorsed by pretty much every public health, dental, and medical organization since it was first introduced. Now, in fact, if you go to the website of the CDC, the very first sentence on community water fluoridation's webpage says, "Many research studies have proven the safety and benefits of fluoride." So when I started to research fluoride, I found that there were, at the time, actually very few human studies examining the health effects of early life exposure to fluoride at levels that are within the range of water fluoridation. And this is what prompted us to do our studies, because we realized we have much less information than we should, considering how long fluoridation has been going on. Now, what about the safety claim? Of the studies conducted to date, they don't all conclude that exposure to fluoride is harmless. And these are the studies I want to talk about today. So let's go back to 2006, when the evidence for adverse health effects of fluoride was reviewed by a scientific panel convened by the National Research Council. This report reviewed numerous health outcomes as listed here. And overall, the committee concluded or reported concerns related to dental fluorosis and skeletal fluorosis with lifetime exposure to fluoride at drinking water concentrations of 4 parts per million. Now, the report also gave some credibility to the possibility that fluoride exposure may be associated with other adverse health outcomes in humans. It was noted that fluoride may trigger other health problems, including damage to the brain and disruption of the thyroid gland. The committee argued that further study was necessary, especially for vulnerable populations. So this was a red flag. In fact, one NRC panel member, Dr. Isaacson, said the report should be a wake-up call. Let's fast forward 15 years because we now have quite a few more studies for a more thorough review of the evidence for developmental neurotoxicity of fluoride. The NTP recently identified over 500 references that were relevant to this topic or to thyroid-related health effects. This review included evidence from animal studies, but this evidence was considered inadequate to inform conclusions on cognitive effects. Instead, it was used to inform on potential mechanistic data. And I think it's also worth noting, so we're talking about 149 human studies. There are far more studies on fluoride neurotoxicity compared to other chemicals like PFOA or air pollution that have been assessed by the NTP. Now, the NTP carefully assessed every study and gave them scores for several domains. So the studies are listed across the top, and the domains that were used as the criteria for determining risk of bias are listed vertically here. Now, of the 149 human studies, 20 were deemed to be of high quality or at low risk of bias. This level of bias is depicted by these green bars, green meaning good and low risk of bias, and yellow and red indicating higher risk of bias. And importantly, of these 20 studies, 18 were in children, and all 18 found statistically significant adverse effects. Now, based on the systematic review of the evidence, the NTP concludes that fluoride is presumed to be a cognitive neurodevelopmental hazard to humans. This conclusion is based on a consistent pattern of findings in human studies across several different populations, showing that higher fluoride exposure is associated with decreased IQ or other cognitive impairments in children. However, the conclusion is somewhat nuanced. They also state, however, the consistency is based primarily on higher levels of fluoride exposure, i.e. those with exposure levels greater than 1.5 ppm in drinking water. So in other words, the studies with exposures falling below 1.5 ppms are inconsistent and may be therefore unclear. So let's return to those 20 high-quality studies that are listed up here. The colored arrows that are shown in blue and purple and black have been added to this figure by Chris Neurath, and acknowledge the slide from him. And what these arrows indicate is the exposure levels at which adverse effects were found. What is notable is that there are some studies, and these are depicted in the blue and the purple, that found adverse effects at water fluoridation or water concentration levels of fluoride that are equivalent levels in urinary fluoride that are below 1.5 milligrams per liter. So I'm going to discuss now in more detail 2 of the studies that were considered to have a low risk of bias, the Bashaj study, as well as the Green et al. Study, because they involved fluoride concentrations that were well below 1.5 ppms. So I'll start with our Canadian study, which was published last year in JAMA Pediatrics. This study was based on the MYRIC sample, which recruited 601 mother-child pairs from 6 cities across Canada. Half of the cities were fluoridated, as shown by the red stars. Mean urinary fluoride levels were about 2 times higher among pregnant women living in fluoridated communities compared with non-fluoridated communities. And as you would expect, water fluoride levels were also significantly higher among women living in fluoridated communities
permit. That is on slow dose
Someone,
5-9. So
can
it's
someone mute there?
and
Can you hear me? Hello?
We can hear you.
Oh,
Someone should mute herself. Okay,
okay.
you should be okay now.
Off there. Okay. So water fluoride levels were also significantly higher among women living in the fluoridated compared with non-fluoridated communities. Now, between 2008 and 2011, the MIRIC program recruited women from 10 cities across different geographic regions of Canada. And at this time, they obtained urinary samples at each trimester of pregnancy. And then about 600 of these women's children from 6 of the cities were then evaluated for the developmental phase of the study when the child was between 3 and 4 years of age. And about half the kids lived in fluoridated communities, and the other half lived in non-fluoridated cities. Now, we used 3 measures of fluoride exposure. The first was maternal urinary fluoride, and here we corrected for urinary dilution. Our second metric was water fluoride concentration, and this was based on tap water fluoride levels that were reported by each water treatment plant that serviced the postal code or the region of where the woman lived during her pregnancy. And the third metric was an estimate of maternal fluoride intake from beverage consumption. This was determined by asking women at 2 time points using a questionnaire to indicate how many cups of water, cups of tea, cups of coffee does she consume during in the real time at trimester 1 and trimester 3. Okay, so results. Our results showed a large and statistically significant effect for boys. The average IQ loss was 4.5 points per 1 milligram per liter increase in mother's urinary fluoride. So I'm reporting here the outcome is full-scale IQ, and you can see the effect on IQ is reduced with increasing levels of maternal urinary fluoride. This is all controlling for relevant covariates. Now, using water fluoride as our predictor, we found an average IQ loss of about 5 points in both boys and girls with every 1 milligram per liter increase in water fluoride. And finally, with respect to daily fluoride intake, we found an average 3.7 IQ point loss, again for both boys and girls, for each 1 milligram increase of fluoride per day in mother's fluoride ingestion. I should add that we conducted a number of sensitivity analyses. Model A is the model that I reported for mother's urinary fluoride. We consider this our gold standard because of the way it was assessed over 3 time points, and it's a biomarker. So relative to Model A, when we add lead exposure and other neurotoxins, you can see there's minimal effect on the coefficient. The effect remains significant. We also controlled for secondhand smoke exposure, prenatal alcohol consumption. We removed outliers, adjusted for creatinine instead of specific gravity, and the effect remains. So to summarize, 1 unit increase in fluoride exposure is associated with an IQ decrement of anywhere between 3 to 5 IQ points. That's controlling for covariates. So after much deliberation, we concluded that these findings indicate the possible need to reduce fluoride intake during pregnancy. And this recommendation was based on the consistency and the strength of our findings. Now, when the paper was published, it was published along with an editorial, as well as an editor's note describing the decision to publish the study, as well as a podcast with 2 JEMA editors describing the findings of the study and their implications. And I think these excerpts from the 2 editors nicely captures the shock and the disbelief that was quite typical, quite a typical reaction by most people. Here, Dr. Christakis is quoted saying, "So when I first saw this title, my initial inclination was, what the hell?" And that's kind of the tone that I think even we had when we first saw the data. And Dr. Rivera says, the effect size is really quite large. The results are really startling. Not surprisingly, the results were startling to others as well. The study received quite a bit of press, but also a lot of backlash, as shown by this title from a national newspaper in Canada. We found ourselves at the crossfire of an attack on science. Critics attacked the methodology of the study and discounted the significance of the results. Critics said it is only one study and continued to conclude that fluoride is unequivocally safe, despite 3 other well-conducted studies over the last 5 years consistently linking fluoride exposure in pregnancy with adverse neurodevelopmental effects in offspring. So I'll present those as well. I know Chris presented this a couple of weeks ago to your group, but I wanted to emphasize that it's not just one study. The Bashash et al. Study, this was based out of Mexico City, and it is also considered a high-quality study, a prospective birth cohort study, and also found a remarkably consistent effect, or our finding was remarkably consistent with the Bashash study, because they found for every 1 milligram per liter increase in urinary fluoride during pregnancy, that was associated with an IQ loss of about 4 to 6 points. I want to add that when the Bashash study came out, which came out before our study, immediately people said, well, that's Mexico City. In Mexico, they add fluoride to salt, and it's not relevant to communities that add fluoride to drinking water. But we argued that, well, if we look at the urinary fluoride levels in women living in Canada, living in fluoridated communities, versus women in Mexico City consuming fluoridated salt, you can see that the 2 groups were actually quite similar. So perhaps it's not that surprising that our outcomes on IQ in 3 to 4-year-olds was quite similar. And I'd also like to highlight this other mother-offspring longitudinal cohort study, also out of Mexico, because this one was actually the first one to be published, and it also finds a steep drop in infants' neurodevelopmental score. And what's interesting, if you look at the decline is quite steep in this lower level of exposure, below 1.5 ppms. So what about postnatal exposure? This is another critical period that we are quite concerned about, given the fact that there's really no benefit of fluoride to the developing brain before the teeth erupt. And of course, the brain is continually developing during this period. Now, exclusive breastfeeding for at least 6 months occurs in roughly 1/3 of Canadians and about 1/4 of Americans. So therefore, this means about 70 to 75% of infants receive formula in the first 6 months of life. Now, this figure shows the infant's dietary intake of fluoride when using non-fluoridated water in the formula. It's not that different from the breastfed baby. So using non-fluoridated water to reconstitute formula and breast milk is quite similar when we're talking about dietary fluoride intake for the infant. In contrast, when using fluoridated water to reconstitute powdered formula, the dietary intake, especially in the first 6 months of life, exceeds the tolerable upper intake level. So using the MyRic cohort, we asked whether formula-fed infants are at risk of lower IQ if formula is made with fluoridated water. So here we categorized the children based on whether mothers reported exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months or not. So women who were in the breastfed group, or the infants in the breastfed group, were exclusively breastfed for at least 6 months, and the formula-fed group had formula introduced within the first 6 months of life. Just to highlight, so looking at the formula-fed babies, as you would expect, those living in a fluoridated community had higher water fluoride levels compared to the non-fluoridated communities. And the difference between living in a fluoridated city like Toronto versus a non-fluoridated city like Vancouver is about 0.5 milligrams per liter. So when I report the results, I'm using this difference because it's a meaningful difference, reflecting the difference in water fluoride exposure in these 2 different communities. The same is true for the breastfed babies. I also want to look at the demographics, because here we're comparing, you can compare breastfed children versus formula-fed children. And as you would expect, the breastfed children had women who had higher levels of education. They were more likely to be married or common law, had higher home scores, the measure of like home enrichment, quality of caregiving. And but I want to emphasize, we're actually we're comparing the formula-fed babies against formula-fed babies. And what's interesting, and to keep in mind, is the formula-fed babies living in fluoridated communities actually had women with higher levels of education compared to the formula-fed babies living in the non-fluoridated communities. And that difference was significant. Okay, so the results showed that for each 0.5 milligrams per liter increase in water fluoride concentration, full-scale IQ was reduced by 4.4 points in the formula-fed group. So that's depicted by this the black line. That was significantly different, with a 0.5 increase in water fluoride concentration. The reduction in full-scale IQ was just over 4 points, but this did not reach significance in the breastfed group. And so there's no association with water fluoride in that group, in the breastfed group. Now, I just reported full-scale IQ. What we noticed was the effect was greatest for performance IQ. So this is a measure of nonverbal reasoning or visual spatial construction skills. And if we look at the coefficients for the formula-fed group and the breastfed group, you actually see that both groups show a decrease in performance IQ with increasing levels of water fluoride. And this is a coefficient, so for a 0.5 milligram per liter increase in water fluoride, you would see a drop of 9 IQ points. That's huge. That's over half a standard deviation on this measure. Interestingly, when we control for prenatal exposure, so MUF is maternal urinary fluoride, when we control for that prenatal exposure, we're still seeing a significant reduction in IQ with increasing levels of water fluoride, more so in the formula-fed group than the breastfed group, but both groups are showing this association, likely capturing the fact that breastfed children are also eventually exposed to fluoridated water as they continue to develop, and are likely drinking the tap water after breastfeeding ends. So we concluded that in the absence of any dental benefit from fluoride consumption in the first 6 months, it is prudent to limit fluoride exposure by using non-fluoridated water to make formula. And just to contrast that recommendation with what we currently find on the recommendation by CDC or the American Dental Association, here they would say you can use fluoridated water for preparing infant formula, but if your child is exclusively consuming infant formula made with fluoridated water, there might be an increased chance for mild dental fluorosis. So to lessen this chance, you might want to use bottled water to mix formula some of the time. So it's a bit of a circular recommendation saying you can use it, but you might not want to. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense. The ADA kind of echoes that recommendation. And keeping in mind that there is no evidence suggesting fluoride is effective pre-tooth eruption. So there's really no benefit, yet there is an increased chance of dental fluorosis, and now our findings suggesting lower IQ with fluoride in water. And in fact, in some stores, you can buy nursery water that is enhanced with fluoride, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. There's zero benefit, if anything, potential for risk. Okay, and I'll also comment on a few studies that have looked at outcomes other than IQ. There are now 3 studies of fluoride and ADHD, and I can speak to these because I'm a co-author on all 3 of these. The first study, and this was spearheaded by Ashley Mallon in 2015, who was really the person who brought fluoride to my attention, with this ecologic study based on data from the USA. And what she found was that there was an increase in ADHD prevalence as the percent of the state fluoridated increased. So in other words, the states that had higher prevalence of fluoridation, like more people receiving fluoridated water, also had higher prevalences of ADHD. And interestingly, this relationship held up for the 3 time periods that she looked at. The Mexico City study, the Element Group, again by Bashash, also found an association, this is with prenatal level of exposure, so maternal urinary fluoride in pregnancy, and an ADHD score. This is a parent-rated questionnaire, and you can see higher levels of maternal urinary fluoride in pregnancy were associated with higher ADHD score on this metric. And lastly, this was a study out of Canada using urinary fluoride. So it's a cross-sectional study. We had urinary fluoride levels and water fluoride levels in youth. We looked at children ages 6 to 17, and we found a higher risk of ADHD for those living in fluoridated areas in our national sample of Canadian children. And so that was just comparing those living in fluoridated versus non-fluoridated communities. If we looked at the actual levels of fluoride in tap water, we found the prevalence of ADHD would be expected to rise from roughly 5.5%, taking like a national average, to about 14% if we do the math using the odds ratio. So in conclusion, a lot has changed since the time when water fluoridation was first introduced. There are more sources of fluoride, like toothpaste. We also have some indication that early life exposures to fluoride have increased. I put a question mark beside this because it's currently under debate. I'm here referring to trends of increasing rates of dental fluorosis in the US, but there's an ongoing debate on how accurate these increases are. We also know more about how fluoride works. A Cochrane review concluded that fluoride's effectiveness occurs post-eruptively, and the effect is mainly topical, not from ingestion. We also now have a moderate level of evidence suggesting developmental neurotoxicity, including some high-quality studies at levels that are less than 1.5 parts per million. And compare this, of course, against no high-quality studies suggesting safety of prenatal exposure to fluoride. So we're left with the question that we've been asked a lot is, do benefits of community water fluoridation justify damaging children's brains and potentially contributing to other adverse health outcomes? So I will end there, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Christine. It's just really an eye-opener presentation, and I would repeat that what the hell, it really bothers us that we don't know so much about such an obvious thing that you're explaining. I would ask a question. Can you please briefly tell us what is the pathophysiology or mechanism behind the effect of fluoride on IQ or ADHD?
Yeah. Great question. And really for this, we have to draw from animal studies. And I mean, there's a lot of different theories out there, from changes from neurotransmitters to thyroid hormone disruption, which might then affect brain development and cause changes in IQ, and as well as attention behaviors via early brain developmental changes. And that's what we're currently exploring in a grant. We're now measuring thyroid hormones during pregnancy to determine whether fluoride is disrupting the thyroid levels early on, and whether this could be a potential mechanism to account for the changes that we're seeing. I don't have a clear answer to point to say this is the mechanism precisely. This is an area of current investigation. There are a lot of different ideas out there. And also depending on the level of exposure in terms of where we see the changes in the brain. But I'm going to say that we're going to have more information on the role of thyroid hormone as a potential mechanism. And the NTP report also comments on some suggested mechanisms, and they bring up thyroid as well as a potential.
Thank you. Since you all have been muted, you need to, I believe, press star and 6 if you are on the phone to unmute yourself and ask questions. Any questions?
Is anyone there?
Everyone is muted, so they need to unmute themselves to ask questions.
I see.
Mm-hmm. So I have another question for you, Christine. What happens when you boil water? What happens to the fluoride? Is it I use boiled water for my children's using formula, but I was wondering if boiling water may reduce the level of fluoride or increase because the concentration of the
Unfortunately, boiling water does not remove fluoride. If anything, it would increase the concentration. So to remove fluoride, you need a special filter, so not Brita, that will not be effective. Reverse osmosis. So removing fluoride does require getting an additional filter on your tap.
What type of filter works better?
There's so many different kinds. It's worth calling a filter company to ask. I don't have I can't answer which one is the best.
No problem. I see that some. Go ahead, ask
Christine, I have a question. So actually, I think it was the beginning of high school, I did a science fair project on the quality of water, tap water in my city versus bottled water. And fluoride was one of those things that came up a lot, as you said, is it good? Is it bad? And it seemed like in bottled water companies, some of them had fluoride that was extremely high, that was past the safety limit. And tap water was really safe in the, let's say, safe in quotes, because it was within those limits. But I know that there are still individuals who fear tap water for a lot of reasons, and whether fluoride is one of them or not, and that they drink bottled water because they're afraid of tap water. And I don't know if you have any suggestions on how we can spread more education about, I don't know, quality of water and what water sources we're drinking, when we should be trusting our water sources. Like in Massachusetts, we have the MWRA, and they control a lot of our tap water. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, well, I think the bottled water, you raised a really important point, that people have been asking for mandatory fluoride labeling on products, including drinking water, because if I understand correctly, the US does not require fluoride to be labeled. And you're right. So so there's tremendous variability in the fluoride content across different brands of water, and same with other countries like Mexico. You can have fluoride in the tap water or in the bottled water. So I think one step is to ask for mandatory reporting of fluoride content. Tea is another product that a lot of people are surprised to find out that based on the age of the tea leaf and how much fluoride is being leached from the soil from where it's grown. So certain regions have high levels of fluoride just due to the geology of the rocks in the region, and that is preferentially like absorbed by the tea plant, especially on more mature leaves, and hence you might have some tea brands that are higher in fluoride content, but again, the consumer wouldn't know that. So right now we're recommending minimize the consumption of black tea during pregnancy, but not all tea is equal. Same with bottled water. We're not advocating for people to switch to bottled water, and I don't think it's right for the onus to be on a pregnant woman or a woman who's formula feeding to have to purchase bottled water, which comes with its own other problems. So, I mean, for us, the low-hanging fruit and where we're advocating that we have the problem of people who require safe water are not able to get it from tap water, and the alternative is really not an optimal solution. Keeping in mind that there are other ways we can get fluoride on teeth, and maybe we should start thinking about other prevention paradigms for prevention of tooth decay, which is also a very important issue to address. But can we do this without ingesting fluoride?
Thank you. That was really a great comment.
Hi, this is Rivka Green. I work with Christine in the fluoride research. I just wanted to add that there is a website, the National Association of County and City Health Officials, NACCHO, that does, if you put in your zip code, you can get information about your water source, including lead as well and fluoride, if that's helpful for information.
Thanks, Rivka.
And Rivka, is that for the US too?
That's for the US. That's only for the US.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, that's only for the US. NACCHO. You can just Google that.
Is that water testing from the plants themselves?
Yeah, that's from itself, and they have phone numbers for each one that you could even call to ask more information, like a citizen can ask questions.
Great. Anyone else? Do you have any question? So, Christine, I think that I would ask the last question.
I just saw something pop up from Chris. Maybe he doesn't have the audio, but I lost it. There was a question. Did you see that?
Yeah, go ahead. That's Chris, actually.
I actually can't see it anymore. Where did it go?
He's asking, can you say anything about new studies that might be in the works or that you and others are hoping to do?
Oh, okay. There's always, so we have the privilege of working with different data sets, so we can ask the same question in the MyRic cohort and the Element cohort, and then the other cohort is another Canadian cohort where we did the ADHD study on. It's called the Canadian Health Measures Survey. So we are looking at some other projects, trying to replicate some other findings. Currently working on sleep. It's a cross-sectional study looking at urinary fluoride. And so today I focused on developmental neurotoxicity, but there's other health effects. We know that fluoride is, it's thought to accumulate in the pineal gland, which is very important for regulation of the sleep-wake cycle. So, and there was a recent study by Ashley Mellon showing disruption to the sleep-wake cycle, higher rates of apnea in people with higher levels of urinary fluoride. So we're looking to replicate this finding in the Canadian cohort. So it's all about replication and trying to see if we get the same effect in different cohorts. So that's something we hope to present this summer. And we're also looking at critical windows of exposure to try to better understand if there is like a particular time, even in pregnancy, or is it that first year of life? And so we're looking at windows of exposure, and then finally interactions between fluoride exposure and other neurotoxins like lead, or interactions between fluoride and diet, nutrition, like calcium intake, for example. So we've got quite a few projects on the go and continue. And then our big project that we're collecting data on, as I said, is thyroid levels.
Wonderful. And also, this was one question too that Chris also asking. Have you done or will you do or do you know of any study that connects older ages neurological diseases like Alzheimer or Parkinson with fluoride?
Yeah, so there's some papers that are looking at the other extreme of the lifespan and Alzheimer's and dementia with fluoride. I would say right now the evidence is minimal in this area, but I think it's a very important area to look at further. Yeah, so it's not conclusive, but there's definitely potential for other long-term health outcomes.
Wonderful. If no other question, I would just like to thank you so much for Christine for coming and speaking with us. If you have new publication or new finding, we'll be glad to bring you back always. And I will be in contact with you. Maybe I get some advice from you on how to proceed with the American Nurses Association and see what Canadian Nurses Association has done probably or what they are doing. So we do go a little bit more stronger with more people from North America to deal with this. So if you don't mind.
Yeah, I'm happy to keep our relationship going and keep you informed. At this point, I think if you are like frontline healthcare professionals and dealing with women who are pregnant or caring for an infant, I think it is prudent. We are making the recommendation that women reduce their intake of fluoride during pregnancy. There's certainly no harm in doing that with pregnant women and young children. So we are. I think that it's time to spread this word, and we are trying to address this with more medical professionals. And I mean, I think the government, at least in Canada, seems to be watching this story closely, and I think the same is true in the U.S. It has been for some time, been receiving a lot of attention, but I think there's more and more mounting evidence. So yes, please stay tuned to see where we go from here.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for coming. And I will send out the link to the recording if you want to watch again or share it with your colleagues. That would be also help us with raising awareness in this regard. Thank you so much, Christiane. I don't know if Bruce was on the call or not, but thank you so much, Bruce, for connecting us to Christine. And thank you, Rivka, for coming and adding some to this presentation.
Great. Thank you, Zita. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.